I'm a member of the team here at Boston Children's Hospital. It's great to see you all, and I'll pass it over to my colleague Osab.
Thanks, Farah. Good afternoon, everyone, and Assalamu alaikum. Welcome. We're excited to be here with you all. I'm Osab Isa. I am a clinical social worker as well as a consultant. And I think some of the acculturation stresses that you're about to hear that we're going to present is one that resonates with me. It feels like it happened yesterday. It happened 20 years ago. So this is not a conversation that's never too boring for you. So I hope you are at the right place.
Thanks, Osab. So some of you may be new to us, so we want to give just a brief overview of who we are. So our team is based at Boston Children's Hospital, Department of Psychiatry, and we've been around for about 20 years. And we have these three core major areas that we work in, which is really the one that we'll be talking about today, is thinking about refugee trauma and resiliency. We're a technical assistance team and do a lot of consultation both locally, nationally, internationally to support communities that have been forcibly displaced. We also work in multidisciplinary models of prevention, and we do some global mental health work as well. This is our team. If you attended last week, you heard from Amy, you heard from Luna and Farah. And then this time, you'll hear from myself, Osab, and Farah, and then Sui is also one that holds us all accountable and makes sure all the technology and everything is working here. So this is our lovely team that you'll hear today and also on future trainings and consultation. To give you a little the background of how we got here and this training series is that we have been in partnership with SOLA for about a year now, and part of our work, a major part of our work, is to really think about supporting the health and well-being of SOLA students. And for us, it felt really important to be able to first understand the experiences of SOLA students. So the work originally started by doing focus groups with school faculty, and some of you have joined those focus groups, host families, and SOLA students here in the US to really understand the experiences and needs of students and your schools in supporting these young women. So through this data process and data collection and analysis, we have then identified these 5 core trainings, and this today is one of them, that we felt like really mapped on nicely to themes and conversations we heard as part of these focus groups. So if you attended our first training, it was only for clinicians and providers and healthcare providers, and it was about really thinking about the mental health of SOLA students. Today will be about culture. Then the following month will be about trauma. And then in the fall, after into the next academic year, we'll do 2 additional trainings on relationships and learning supports. And then as part of those trainings, as you'll see here on the other side, is that we have a series of consultation and skill building spaces. So while the training itself is a little bit more didactic and kind of covering major best practices and content, the space for consultation is really to kind of dig deeper into the content and think about how does this apply to your school and SOLA students that you are serving. Today, I hope you're in the right place, as Osab said. We'll be talking about understanding the role of culture and cultural adjustment. And then following this professional development training, we'll have a series of consultation calls for educators, host families, and as well as support staff. I will also say that the training is being recorded. So if your colleague is not here and couldn't make it, we do share the slides and recordings after the training. So you'll be able to get this as well. Our hope for today is to hopefully do 3 things. One, we'll kick off by really talking a little bit about the history of Afghanistan and the role of culture in Afghan communities. If you attended last time, some of this may be review. If you haven't, you'll kind of get the full scope. From there, we'll talk a little bit about what is the process of acculturation and cultural adjustment for SOLA students once they arrive into host communities. And then we'll close out by doing some small group discussion around the role of cultural humility in fostering meaningful connections and programming with SOLA students. Okay, so to get us started, today is all about culture. And culture is everything, and we as people are. It's all around us. It's part of us. It's in our. It's part of our ecologies. So when we think about culture, we think about, there's many definitions, but we think about really a set of accepted behaviors, patterns, values, assumptions that are shared among a group of people, or common experiences. We know that culture defines social structures, decision-making practices, and communication styles. So we think about our individual culture, but many of you work in schools, and there is a school culture and a way of being and a way of communicating. That is one. There is individual culture, there's the family culture, there's a community culture. So we really think about culture, as you see here on this picture, across levels and layers. The individual to interpersonal, to institutional, to community, to systems. And so much of our conversations today, cut across all of these layers and systems. Culture is also something we learn. It impacts everyone and influences how we respond in different interactions we have with those around us. It's also communication. Is a way that people create, send, process, interpret information, as we'll discuss today. And we also know it's deeply complex, meaning that it shapes and is experienced by each individual differently. So how I define culture than somebody else on this call may be very different. Or even, as we'll talk today, so much of our conversation is going to be about Afghanistan, Afghan culture. We know that even within Afghan culture, there are similarities, but there's also differences, individually, interpersonally, across communities, across tribes, and so forth. And, the most important things are that culture starts with us. So how we understand our culture then influences how we understand other cultures and how we interact with other cultures. All right, I'm going to pass it now to Osab.
Right. Thanks, Vanya. So we will watch The Danger of a Single Story by Chimam. I swear I had her name right like 30 seconds ago, and then now I'm messing up. But Chimamanda, she's a Nigerian writer. Some of you might have seen it, but this clip is only 4 minutes long. She has the full talk is available on her full video is available on TED Talk. So if you have a minute, feel free to watch it. But her work's powerful, and we'll just really highlight kind of the assumptions that we made of other people or humans that just exist in the world, right? And the dangers that can have sometimes.
I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, living domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me as an African was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. It is impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. There is a word, an Igbo word, that I think about whenever I think about the power structures of the world, and it is nkali. It's a noun that loosely translates to be greater than another. Like our economic and political worlds, stories too are defined by the principle of nkali. How they are told, who tells them, when they are told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. The Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with secondly. Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Start the story with the failure of the African states and not with the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story.
All right. You must be wondering what's next. So you guys will have a minute, not minute, but you'll have some time to reflect on these questions of the video. What does how does the video resonate with you? And thank you, Sweet Bullet. If you click that link, there's a little plus sign that you can write. But what is a single narrative or single assumption that you have made about SOLA students over time that you have realized that are not true, right? So again, this is really meant to be a moment for us to reflect and an exercise. There is no judgment. Nobody will know who wrote what you, if you decide to write something. But we encourage you please to participate. Does everyone see the little plus sign on the bottom? It's the blue. So if you click that, then you can write. I'll just read a few. I will continue writing it. Also, the students pray 5 times a day. That was each girl's story is unique, and that not one narrative can define any of them. Students might be or are much more complex than the image we often see in the popular media. Very true. Life is always more complex than how it is presented at first. What is true for one student is now necessarily true for another. True. There are so many times that I have to reset my understanding because there are so many experiences they are having. So true. But thank you all. Continue writing, finishing up, please. If you haven't had a chance to participate. And then somebody wrote on the chat, I didn't assume anything as this is the first time I had a SOLA student. Right. Well, I know that not everyone is sitting in front of a computer and might be on the phone joining. Please feel free to unmute yourself and share anything that you either assume or wish you knew or have done it differently because what you learn. Well, thank you all for participating. I will take quiet as a good thing and we'll keep moving on the next slides. Farah and Vanya, anything that you wanted to add before I turn to you guys?
I think, thank you, Osab. You know, just to add, as we think about today in culture, and you know, as Farah enters her section, is exactly what many of you shared, is that while there's commonalities, there's all differences, and to really, you know, stretch all of our thinking and assumptions as we talk about culture and cultural adjustment that is so unique to each person, which is why we wanted to kind of start with this video and to begin by thinking about where am I in this? And how I enter into this space. So thank you for sharing. And we can pass the Farah now.
Yeah, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about the history of Afghanistan, culture, religion, education, mental health, how all these things kind of intersect and interact in various ways. So if you were here in the last training, we went over this briefly, but we'll just review a little bit about the history of Afghanistan. So like I mentioned last time, if we go back to 1979 and we start the story there, then that's when the then Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. And then this initiated a war between the United States and the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And that lasted about around a decade until the Soviet Union withdrew. And so with the Soviet Union withdrawing out of Afghanistan, this then led to factional fighting among different groups to kind of secure political power in the country. And so there's this factional fighting amongst different groups. And then in 1996, one of these groups, the Taliban, rises to power, and they impose kind of these extreme interpretations of Islamic law and severe restrictions for women and various aspects of social life for both women and men. And then in 2001, after the 9/11 attacks, the US invaded Afghanistan and was in the country for 20 years. And so we know that in 2021, the US government withdrew their forces from Afghanistan, and this then leads to the reemergence of the Taliban-controlled government, and that's what we see till today in 2024. So that's just a little bit about the history of Afghanistan and some of the political conflicts that have happened in the country for the past 5 decades. So now I'm going to just talk a little bit about Afghanistan and its diversity. So I mean, within the country of Afghanistan, there's about 42 million people living there. But of course, due to all these conflicts that have been happening for the past 50 years, there's been mass displacement with people fleeing outside of the country for various reasons. And Afghanistan has the 3rd largest displaced population in the world. So there's Afghans living in neighboring countries in Afghanistan. There's Afghans living in Western countries far away from Afghanistan. And the first kind of massive wave of Afghans coming outside of Afghanistan dates back to when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. So there's been Afghans living outside of Afghanistan for many decades now. Afghanistan is a multi-ethnic society. It's very diverse. So we don't want to view Afghans and Afghanistan as just a monolith with one identity. There's no national culture or identity, kind of parallel to here in the United States, where there might not necessarily be a national identity or a national culture because it's quite diverse. There are overlapping cultures and customs across different ethnic groups, but there are differences as well. People in Afghanistan speak lots of different languages, but kind of the official languages of the country are Dari, or sometimes called Farsi, and Pashto. And then there's minority languages. On the picture that I have here on the slide, these are all like well-known Afghans who are public figures and are known to Afghans, and some of you might know them here in the United States. And you can see how they all look very different. No one really looks the same. All Afghans look a little bit different. Even I, as an Afghan, if I see a group of people outside, I couldn't tell you which one's an Afghan because we just look very different. So there isn't like a kind of a phenotypically obvious feature about Afghans. We all look a little different. And then even in the Afghan national anthem, these are the lyrics on the right-hand side of the slide. You can see that they list out all the different, some of the different ethnic groups in Afghanistan, or the majority ones at least. So this is just to highlight how it's a very diverse country with people of different backgrounds. Yeah. There are, of course, minoritized identities in Afghanistan as well. These individuals, they might not speak the two official languages of Afghanistan. They might speak a different language. And so then it's not maybe as easy to be a part of the larger society if you're not speaking or reading and writing in the kind of two official government languages. They also might not have as much social and political representation. Again, that's just mainly due to where ethnic minorities are living in Afghanistan. They tend to live in more remote areas, more rural areas, and they're much smaller in size population-wise compared to kind of these more larger ethnic groups such as Pashtuns or Tajiks, for example. And so that's just, if you're working with, if the SOLA girls that you're working with or have as students in your schools coming from ethnic minority backgrounds, they might have a different experience than individuals with more ethnic majority backgrounds. So now I'm going to speak a little bit about religion in Afghanistan. So if we go back to like the early times when there was no even border of Afghanistan, religions like Zoroastrianism, Hinduism, and Buddhism were prominent religions, especially since Afghanistan was part of the Silk Road due to its location in Central Asia. So that's kind of how these religions spread into the country. In the 7th century, Islam was introduced to the country following an Arab conquest. And then by the 9th century, this becomes the dominant religion in the region. In the present day, the majority of Muslims in Afghanistan are Sunni Muslims, and there is also a Shia Muslim minority. There are other religious groups in Afghanistan, such as Hindus, Sikhs, Baha'is, Christians, Jewish people. They all together constitute less than 0.3% of the population. And in light of kind of the Taliban takeover of the country in 2021, many of these individuals and communities have since fled the region in fear of persecution based on their religious beliefs. So it's not to say that the whole country is made up of Muslims, but non-Muslims make up a very small percentage. And then just, these are just kind of the intersection of like religion and culture. There are religious holidays in Afghanistan and cultural holidays, and there's a difference. So religious holidays, these are kind of the important ones. Right now, it's the month of Ramadan. Islam follows a lunar calendar, so none of these holidays are on a specific date. Every year, they're on a different day based on the lunar calendar. So this year, we are now currently in the month of Ramadan, which is the 9th month of the Islamic calendar, when Muslims fast from dawn to sunset. So maybe some of the SOLA girls that you are working with are fasting right now. So basically people wake up before dawn, they eat a meal, and then they fast. So they don't drink water, they don't eat food, they abstain from saying negative things, doing negative things, for example, and then they break their fast at iftar, which is at sunset. And people usually have a date, and then they'll have their dinner, their food. And then after Ramadan, there's like the Ramadan Eid, and then there's the next Eid. So after Ramadan, there's Eid al-Fitr. So that marks the end of the month of Ramadan. People will celebrate, they'll get together with their family. Younger folks get gifts and money. People eat large meals and eat various sweets. That this year is likely going to be on April 9th or 10th. And then there's the next Eid, which is Eid al-Adha. That's, I think, going to be in the second week of July this year. And that celebrates the willingness of the Prophet Abraham to sacrifice his son in an act of obedience to God. And so people in Afghanistan and in other Muslim countries will sacrifice an animal, usually a lamb or a cow, in commemoration of that. And then they'll donate the meat to their family, their friends, and the poor. So those are important Islamic holidays. And then important cultural holidays. Just last week was Nowruz, which means New Year. It started as a Zoroastrian holiday, but now it's just viewed as a cultural holiday across various countries in the region, including Iran, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, for example. And this just marks the beginning of spring. So people will clean their house, they'll do spring cleaning, they'll wear new clothes, they'll visit their friends and family. They'll eat half meweh, which is an Afghan 7-fruit dish, but it's not a religious holiday, it's a cultural holiday. So yeah, these are some of the religious and cultural holidays that some Afghans celebrate. And just to talk a little bit about Islamic values and practices. So someone had said in the poll or in the link that we just had that they thought that every SOLA girl prays 5 times a day. So as we've been informed at this moment, all SOLA girls identify as Muslims. Of course, there's varying degrees of religious practice, and that might change as someone gets older over time. They might practice their religion more, they might practice their religion less. So rather than viewing it as like, these are the Islamic pillars and values and practices, and everyone practices the same way. In Afghanistan and in countries all around the world, Muslims will be practicing their faith in various degrees of religiosity, I guess. So some people will pray 5 times a day, some people won't. But we wouldn't say that makes them any less of a Muslim. You could still identify as a Muslim and practice whatever you are comfortable with or what you choose to practice. So these are the 5 pillars of Islam. So there's the declaration of faith, prayer, charity, fasting, and then making pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in your lifetime. Values that are deemed as good values to have from an Islamic standpoint include being kind to people and animals, being charitable, being forgiving, being honest, practicing patience, fighting for justice, respecting elders. And there is an emphasis on modesty for girls and women, again, similar to practicing maybe prayer and these other parts of Islam. That will also look different person to person. Some individuals might choose to wear the hijab, some individuals might not choose to wear, some might wear more modest clothing, some might not. It just depends really on the individual and how they grew up practicing the faith or how they choose to practice the faith. Yeah. Now I'll just speak a little bit about Afghan families. So they're generally large and multi-generational, meaning that multiple family members all live in the same house. In Afghanistan, some homes will have like 2 floors or 3 floors, and you have like 1 floor for like your grandparents and 1 floor for your parents and 1 floor for the kids, for example, if they're a wealthier family. But adult children tend to live at home. Women typically move into their husband's family after they get married. Typically, the authority is in the hands of the eldest family member. So if there's a grandfather or a father, that person might have the authority in the home. If not, it might be the eldest son. In the family, everyone has a role and serves a purpose. So everyone kind of has their designated role in their family, and they participate, collectively as one family unit by practicing their role and responsibilities. Typically, men will work outside of the home and women will work inside of the home, but that is, again, different based on where you're living in Afghanistan, if you have access to education and work, and maybe how conservative or how liberal your family might be. So that's dependent on multiple variables. And of course, over time, more and more women have been part of social life, employed working outside of the home as compared to maybe several decades ago. It's really on parents to kind of impart religious and moral education to their children. So parents have a responsibility in teaching their kids the Islamic faith and morals based on Islam. And from an Islamic standpoint, family relationships are very important and are highly valued, and younger people in a family should respect the elder people in their family, and elder people in the family should respect younger people in the family. So if you were here in the training last time, we talked a little bit about this, but I'll go over Afghan education and school culture a little bit. Of course, because of all these conflicts I spoke about earlier, the education system has also been devastated by the conflicts in Afghanistan. Right now, there's about 3.7 million children out of school, 60% of them being girls, as girls have been banned from attending school after 6th grade in Afghanistan under the Taliban government. But typically speaking, or generally speaking, the education system follows a 6-3-3 structure. So 6 years of primary school, 3 years of lower secondary school, and then 3 years of high school, upper secondary. So we can think of it like elementary school, middle school, high school. Kids typically start school at the age of 7. There are differences between urban areas and rural areas. So of course, in bigger cities, there are public schools, there are private schools. In more recent years, there have been an emergence of private schools funded by foreign countries. So like Turkey would set up like private schools in various cities. And so students would go to the private school and they might learn foreign languages like Turkish or English and things like that. Versus children who are living in rural areas, they might not have as much access to formal schooling. If they do, they might have to travel really long distances. So typically children might attend a religious school rather than a formal kind of school that focuses on various subjects. In rural areas, girls are also are often less likely to be in school compared to boys, versus in urban areas, there are more girls in school compared to rural areas. In school in Afghanistan, girls typically wear a school uniform, so kind of like the one in the picture where they'll wear like a white hijab and a black tunic or a black school uniform. Appearance is very strict, so folks can't have nail polish or makeup or anything like that. There's kind of this emphasis on uniformity. Schools are typically separated by gender, so there'll be the girls' school, and then maybe across the road there's the boys' school. Students stay in one classroom and the teachers just enter the classroom during their class period. So the math teacher comes, teaches math, and then leaves. And then the history teacher comes and teaches history. When teachers walk into the class, students typically stand up as a sign of respect for the teacher. And if they raise their hand and they get called on, they'll stand up when called on to give an answer to what the teacher had asked. Since computers and internet are a privilege in Afghanistan, most homework and assignments are still just done paper, pencil. Usually a subject will have its own textbook, and the textbook has a homework lesson at the end of each chapter. Unlike here in America, where there are letter grades, in Afghanistan, it's based on a ranking system. So if your class is 30 students, there's a number 1 student, and then there's a number 30 students. So it's kind of like you accumulate points for your assignments and exams, and whoever has like the most points is the student number 1. And if you have the second most points, you're student number 2. And so you're given a number rank rather than letter grade. So that's just typical, generally speaking, typically school in Afghanistan. Of course, SOLA girls who have been in Rwanda for a bit might have more experience with more Western styles of school, but this is just something to be mindful of for the SOLA girls who might have come directly from Afghanistan, that these were some of their experiences in school, and how it's a little bit different than school here in the United States. Just to speak briefly about some ongoing challenges in Afghanistan, of course, like every country, Afghanistan continues to have its own challenges, especially as it relates to kind of these intersecting factors of gender and religion and culture and ethnicity and things like that. So for example, ethnic minorities such as the Hazara community in Afghanistan has experienced ethnic cleansing and genocide as a result of kind of the conflicts that have been going on in Afghanistan. And so they have a very different experience than other ethnic groups. Of course, as we know, women and girls have been banned from accessing education after the 6th grade in Afghanistan. Even though Islamically, girls' education is a right, and that they are owed kind of that right to get an education. And then Shia Muslims are also often experience religious discrimination as the majority religion is Sunni Islam. And so these are just kind of some examples of how minoritized identities in Afghanistan continue to experience various discrimination and challenges, and how that might influence someone's experience as an Afghan based on some of these factors. And so those are just some of the ongoing challenges in Afghanistan. And then we talked a little bit about this last training, but just to briefly talk about mental health among Afghans. Research suggests that there's higher rates of PTSD and depression and anxiety. In recent years, issues of suicidality and drug use are becoming emerging problems that are understudied and we need more information about. There's, of course, higher risks for individuals with minoritized identities, likely related to some of the things I just talked about. Psychology, mental health counseling, school counseling, these aren't well-established fields in Afghanistan, so people might not be as familiar with them. There's no kind of established psychologists or mental health counselors or anything like that, or education programs to even have that kind of job in Afghanistan. Psychiatry as a subspecialty of medicine is an established field, so people might have more familiarity with what a psychiatrist does. And so that's all to say these kind of professional mental health supports that we think about here in the West are not things that are accessible or people might not even be familiar with if they're from Afghanistan. Many might seek professional mental health services, if they do seek it at all, only as a last resort, as mental health is not something that people typically talk about. There's still kind of a taboo around speaking about mental health and mental illness. People feel like if they talk about maybe symptoms of mental illness, that they might be viewed as crazy. People also, from a cultural standpoint, might not want to burden their family members with their problems. So they just kind of keep this information to themselves and kind of try to manage it on their own. And help-seeking behavior for mental health issues is not a cultural norm. People, if you do share like with your family, oh, I'm feeling depressed, they might say, okay, don't tell anyone, because if this gets out, then the whole neighborhood's going to think something about you. So to then go and seek help would then kind of be acknowledging publicly that you're going through something, and that wouldn't be culturally appropriate. But from a religious standpoint, good health, both physically and mentally, is really important in Islam. It's emphasized that Muslims take care of their physical and mental health. And that in studies with Afghans, some had shared that being together with their family, keeping themselves busy, and engaging in leisurely activities are some ways that they can support their mental health and well-being. And then again, just to speak a little bit more about help-seeking behaviors. So some examples of help-seeking behavior among Afghans could be reaching out to their religious leader, so like an imam at a mosque, praying, going to psychotropic medications. Some of the reasons for that is their mental health symptoms sometimes might manifest more as somatic symptoms. And so there's this idea that if I'm experiencing kind of these physical symptoms, then I can go to the doctor and get medicine to address the physical symptoms, not necessarily thinking, oh, I'm going to take medication for mental health reasons. It's more of a way to address things like insomnia, for example. And then so getting support from family and friends. Perceptions around mental illness. Sometimes people think about mental illness as like getting the evil eye, or like nazar, which is basically this belief that a person's jealousy or envy towards me can create some problem in my life. So some people might attribute their mental health challenges to getting nazar, like someone gave their evil eye to me, and that's why I'm experiencing these mental health symptoms. Some people might believe that a person's possessed by a mythical creature. They're called jinn, and they're talked about in Islam as well. So it's from like a religious standpoint, might believe that they're possessed by a jinn. Sometimes people might choose medication over therapy, again, because it's kind of this quicker fix, and it makes sense if one has a biomedical view of mental health, so, or if one is experiencing somatic symptoms. So if I'm not able to sleep at night, and that might be the root cause, might be because I'm experiencing stress, but then there's a medication for insomnia, they might say, okay, to address this insomnia, I'm going to take these medications. And it's also less stigmatizing in that you could tell a person, like, I'm having this physical symptom, I'm taking medication for it, versus telling them, I'm going through a hard time, or I'm sad, or something like that, which might not be as easy to share with others. And then just some other ways that are kind of more informal ways of seeking help is that individuals might have social gatherings, they might connect with their community, they might reach out to support from other Afghans. And in terms of therapy, individual counseling, again, is not a norm or a part of life in Afghanistan, but group approaches could be helpful in that it gives kind of that sense of community, and I'm coming to my community and having a conversation about things, versus kind of the individual therapy that might not be as familiar or comfortable. So these are some help-seeking behaviors among Afghans. So I know I shared so much about Afghanistan and Afghan culture and everything, but we wanted to give you all a moment of reflection to think about what, if anything, resonates with you, and what connections might you be making based on what I've just talked about, and thinking about your work with the SOLA students.
And I believe we'll have another Padlet. So feel free to use that, or like OSAB shared last time, if you are driving or doing other things and if you want to just unmute and share, that's totally fine as well. Stop sharing so we can see the Padlet. There's lots of good comments around family values and lives impact the lives of even here far away. Absolutely. We'll talk about that in a second. Underscored the need for connection. Absolutely. Thinking about the theme of collective versus individual support systems. Considering hearing more about how to support SOLA students in their mental health. Cultural manifestations of mental health. Okay. Consistent with other international population in terms of education, mental health, help-seeking norms. Absolutely. So maybe we'll continue just for sake of time, but please keep adding. I also want to share it. Thank you, Farah, for such a thoughtful section. You know, we have Farah here. We also have Freshta here. So we have multiple Afghans on this call. So it's also a really wonderful opportunity if you have questions or reflections. We have some incredible cultural experts on this call. So please take the opportunity to ask questions as well. And we'll hopefully have some time at the end. Okay, so let me just go to our next section here. So Farah has talked about a little bit about life in Afghanistan. I'm going to transition us, and give me a second. I have to go through all the slides, unfortunately. I'm going to transition us to think about now life once SOLA students arrive to the US, right? And whatever their host community is. But for us here, for today, is thinking about US context. So we know that a lot of our team has done a lot of work on thinking about what are the core kind of experiences that individuals have once they arrive to a new country. And we talked about this a little bit last time, so I won't go into it too much, but we have identified these 4 core areas that we think about are identified as like key stressors that individuals who have been displaced and or arriving into a new community may experience. One is thinking about resettlement stress. So, for SOLA students, this may look a little different, but really thinking about like upon arrival, just, setting the stage for like, how do I figure out where I need to go in school for things? How do I go to the doctor? What are my supports? Like figuring out those day-to-day resettlement stressors. Students may also experience isolation, and some of you talked about this on your responses of being away from family, being away from friends, being in a new community where you don't know anybody, and reconnecting can be, feeling sense of loneliness, feeling, am I going to see my family again, given they're back in Afghanistan? What does my future hold for being with those I love? So there can be experiences of isolation and distress. There can also be experiences, and our whole next training is about trauma, of traumatic stress that the SOLA student may have experienced while in Afghanistan, traumatic stress that they've experienced during the process of evacuation and resettlement, and traumatic experiences once you arrive into a host country. And finally, what we're going to talk about today is process of acculturation. So thinking about how I adjust culturally to this new place. How do I keep hold of my identity and culture that Farah, so beautifully talked about today, and I'm now entering a new culture and a new place, and how do I navigate those two? So when we think about culture, we're really thinking about this process of both cultural and psychological change that follows process of resettlement. Cultural meaning, I'm in a new place, it's a different culture, a different language, but also psychologically, what does that mean for me? Where do I belong? Where do I fit in? What identity am I now? And how do I navigate these different identities? As Osab said in the beginning, acculturation is a lifelong process. As somebody who's moved to this country when I was 10, I always say I'm forever going through a acculturation process, and it truly is something that never goes away. There's different stages of it in process, but it's always part of you if you have resettled into a new place. And what impacts acculturation, how people acculturate, is really dependent on a couple of these factors. One, what's the reason that people have left their home country? What is the reason that they are here getting educated in the US? And if we think about what Farah was talking about, the context of education in Afghanistan and the evacuation process, that occurred, that's a huge factor in then thinking about why I'm here and whether I can go back to my country. We also think about context of resettlement, meaning to what extent does the individual feel like they are welcomed and supported in their new community? Is this a community that, welcomes you, or is this a community that you feel like does not want you to be part of their space? We're also thinking as part of that, to what extent has a student experienced feelings of welcomeness or potentially feelings of discrimination and alienation. And we know that acculturation is also really dependent on age and stage of life. So typically, especially if we think about SOLA students who are coming into a school, that's very different than, if you're maybe coming later stage in life and your experience with now new culture may be less. So thinking about that they're at the stage of already identity development and they're entering a new culture may look different than somebody else. And we typically know that children often acculturate more quickly than adults, and based on research. So what, then you may be wondering, like, what are the common, my computer is doing a thing. So what is then a culture of stress? Well, a culture of stress is essentially stress that emerges from challenges of adapting to a new culture, host culture, but also challenges of holding on to your home culture. For a very long time, research used to say, that assimilation was the way to go, meaning that the more that you take on the new culture, the more quote unquote successful you'll be. We know now through lots of work and research and experience that actually bicultural individuals, meaning those that are able to retain their home culture or origin culture and adopt pieces of the new culture, tend to overall have higher self-esteem, lower psychological distress, and lower overall acculturation, right? And what you'll see here is kind of a visual of that. Here on one end, this is, let's say, the Afghan culture that the young women are coming in. This may be US or the New England school that they're in. And this in between is how we all kind of fall on the spectrum, meaning that no single person will acculturate the same way or look the same way in that process. Some, may keep their origin culture, take on new culture, but then they may also, as you see this like light blue color, they may also take other pieces of other cultures, right? So just the point is that it is a dynamic process, and that ultimately, those that overall, fare out in terms of their overall well-being are individuals that are really able to kind of, hold and navigate both home culture and new culture. We know that there are lots of acculturative stressors that individuals experience upon arrival, and I'm sure you've heard some of these from SOLA students at your school, or if you have other international students in your communities. So learning a new language, and or even if you're coming in with English, right? Just now being in a English dominant community is a stressor in itself. Adapting to new customs, a new way of life, like Farah saying, school in Afghanistan, you stand up when the teacher comes in. So even how school operates and rules of a system may be different. Change in dress or appearance, right? How do I show up in my classes? Do I wear the same clothes? Do I take on some of the new things from a new culture? Is all part of this negotiation that happens. Adjusting to new food and cuisine that you may not have before. Maybe modifying your behavior or social norms, and you'll see some quotes from the students that talks about this. Making friends in the new place. What's so unique about SOLA students is that, 2 of them come into each school, meaning that, there are all of these new people that you're entering that are now you have to kind of become friends with and join social circles. Acquiring new cultural knowledge of what are the common norms, again, both in a local level, community, and then a system. Participating in new activities, playing a sport for the first time, joining a music club, arts, and so forth. Maybe embracing new beliefs that you haven't had before, or negotiating which beliefs to keep and which beliefs to take on. Adapting to a new climate. This can be a big one, given where we live and the winters. And learning, new sports or political news and culture of a new system. So all of these, depending on a person, can add certain stressors in day-to-day life. It's also important to think about, where cultural conflict happens. And I like to think that it happens kind of on these 3 levels. One, there's the internal piece, right, of struggle of negotiating a new identity, especially given that all the young people you work with are either, are at that prime of identity development naturally. So there's already kind of questioning of who am I? Where do I belong? Where am I going? And then that is layered on by being a new place and negotiating a new culture. They may struggle to make sense of, or clash between, what my parents say or what my family values are versus what I'm being exposed to. Even though parents may be really far away, as Farah was saying, family is a huge piece of identity and sense of groundingness in one's life. So negotiating what I share, what do I don't share, and what do I keep. Interpersonally, there may be conflict sometimes, right, with families and other adults of thinking about what cultural values and expectations I hold on to and what I let go, but also conflict with peers of, misunderstandings, cultural misunderstandings, social misunderstanding that may happen that may make one feel like, oh, do I really fit in here? And does this community get me? On a systems level, thinking about coming into a new school experience that is so different from your own and wanting to fit in and wanting to excel and do well. Students may experience discrimination, which can, be associated with high levels of depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, and, experience lower self-esteem as part of that. And we actually know that when we think about acculturation as a whole, discrimination often is a key factor in how individuals experience this post-resettlement context. So we wanted to share, as I said in the beginning, we did focus groups with students when we first started this project, and we interviewed students about their experience. I just wanted to highlight some of the cultural stressors that SOLA students from your schools identified when they were sharing, and they're spot on to what we were talking about here. So this student says, my religion, my language, and they're very important to me. Like are very big parts of my identity. So I feel like language is every part. Like you had to talk to your own native language and also religion, which is Islam. So yeah, they're a very important part. And also food a bit. This is part of the integral how Afghan culture is part of one's identity. The student talks about the struggle to form or integrate their identity into a new culture. I'm thinking of not changing a lot. It's a big deal for me. And I would not naturally tell my sister to do that because I'm older than them. They also don't like to be changed a lot. I'm telling her not to change, or it's okay if you are in America. We have to be careful with our own culture. If you care about your culture, it's a big thing. So you can kind of hear the negotiation, but you can also then hear sometimes pressures of, if I'm the older sibling, what do I want to model to my younger siblings? Or if I have older siblings, and I'm looking up to them, how do I want to negotiate that? So I hope you can see kind of the negotiation piece in there. This is a little bit the peer conflict I talked a little about earlier. The reason they were asking was because they cared. They were curious. They wanted to help, but they were not helping. I feel like all of us were feeling pitied. It feels bad. It made us sad. Look, how Afghan people are poor. They don't have any. I don't know what to say. Even if I talk about it, it makes me sad. I did not want them to know my story. I think it was a mistake for SOLA to do that. So this student is talking about how, sometimes there's a single Afghan story, and it's often really kind of deficit based in the violence and the conflict that's occurred in Afghanistan. And often students say, I want to be known more for other things about me. I'm still a teenager. I have ideas, I have opinions, and I don't want to be known for this one thing. So you can see how this is impacting this young woman. And then the students talking about the difference in life and cultural norms. They do not worry about things I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about my family, but for them, it's not that different. There are too many different things you're thinking about. What should I do tomorrow? How to have fun in summer? But what I'm thinking about, my friend, how can we see our family and what's happening with my family? How is the school? Girls going to school or not? This is the thing I'm talking about with my SOLA friends. But I can't talk about that with my friends I make in school. I think it's a normal thing to get. I think I was trying to meet with them, but sometimes it was hard for me because I was thinking differently than them. So that's the peer piece of trying to foster relationships in a new community, in a new space that may be different from you. And then conflicts around children and caregivers. And then our other students just found, this is from an educator, just found out that she's getting into a school, but she's going to be repeating 9th grade for the 3rd year in a row. So she's like, I'm going to be almost 21 when I graduate, and she's very stressed about telling her parents that, because her parents, want to make sure that she's on the right path. So this piece of what do I share, what do I not share, expectations of family, life in the US, and negotiations around that. And finally, struggles to adjust the school due to language. I don't have teachers who are going to grade them realistically when they are so much lower than everybody else in what they're bringing into the classroom. And again, it's not intellect. They're very capable, but they don't have the English skills to be able to keep up with the rest of the class. And so that's been a constant force of, I think, stress. I think for the girls, it's been as well. So this is from an educator perspective of, watching and kind of figuring out how to support, but also thinking about how this is showing up in the lives of students in the classrooms. And this was the last one, I promise. And then finally, thinking about experiences of discrimination. So the student shared, Yes, the religion, you know, like sometimes when they're here, like when you are having a class and then the students were asking me, and I was like, are you Muslim? The Americans like, yes, we are Muslim people. And they say like, what is your God? And then sometimes they're laughing and they're saying things like, what is your look? And you're not leaving them. And it's really hard. Like, you know, like we're respecting your religion and you have to respect our religion. And it's really bad for us because like our school, it happened. And I see that they were laughing like all. And it's like, I was really sad about that. So this feeling of othering based on one's identity. Okay. So how do we then, what is the role of schools when we think about these experiences? On one end, you know, the school can be a space where, you know, student may be experiencing pressure or simulation of internalized racism, feeling unsafe, hard to navigate social pressures, discrimination, and so forth. On the other end, right, school can be a place that honors wisdom and cultural teachings, that fosters pride in different identities, that engages in cultural sharing, that holds complexity of different identities, and that really advocates for how we think about anti-discrimination policies and practices, both interpersonally and as a whole school. So as all of you are on this call and thinking about what are some ways that I can support, whether you're an educator or a host parent or support staff, you know, first and foremost, thinking about how do you right now honor and attend to the complexity of students' identities development and cultural process? How do we take time to learn about students' language and culture and holidays by being on this call? That's one way, right? But what are some other ways? How do you also create opportunities that promote cultural sharing and cultural exchange? Again, not just among SOLA students, but across your school community. How do you support cultural and religious practices? So dietary needs, prayer time, spaces for prayer, and so forth. And then how do we think about cultural and linguistically informed instruction and curricula? The teachings and the systems in your school, are they reflective of student identities and all student identities? And then thinking about what are the bullying or anti-discrimination policies that you have in your school, not just for what students can share or where do students go for help, but also training and education for teachers of how to respond when these things happen in the classroom. And then finally, what are ways that, you know, we all reflect our own assumptions and biases and narratives to attend to stressors that individuals may be experiencing. Okay. So I think based on time, we're going to skip this last reflection and go to our final kind of set of questions, and I'll pass it to Osab.
Yeah, thanks, Maya. And I know initially when we planned these questions, we were thinking putting people in the groups, and based on I think number of you are also on the phone, maybe. So does it, again, I hate to offer options and waste more time, but does it make sense to stay together for maybe 7 minutes and reflect on these questions? Or would people benefit and go into breakout rooms?
Do we have a sense?
I think given the time, we might as well stick together 7 more minutes and just, that's my own perspective, but whatever you want, whatever people want.
I want what the audience want.
What time are we ending?
At 3:30. So we can stay if folks and you know, reflect on these questions, but also open up for broader questions too. As because I know we've talked a lot at you in the last 70 minutes.
People might be more willing to share in smaller groups.
What do you think?
It's like if you're, how about this? Raise your hand or whatever sign that you can put it up to if you want to stay together. Show hand, show sign. Okay.
See a couple. So maybe we